some kind of rules in some way have existed about how to fight a war. So they're so horrific, they're so awful that they are elevated to a much higher level than the everyday average crime. I mean, I bet you don't know that Australia was bombed by the Japanese in World War II.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
Hello everyone. Today my guest was Melani O'Brien, PhD in international law, and she's deputy head of a school of research at University of Western Australia in Perth, and she is also president of International Association of Genocide Scholars. Today we discussed the history of creation of international criminal law, how it developed, how the different stages it went through. We started from Nuremberg trials, that we discussed tribunals, international criminal tribunals in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda. We also discussed some benefits and problems related to International Criminal Court, and also had, I think, a very, very useful conversation about these matters. Please watch our video, listen to our podcast, and read history. It's always very, very, very interesting. Hello, Mel. It's my real pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Suren. It is wonderful to be here in beautiful Yerevan.
And today we're going to talk about international criminal law, right? You are engaged in and let's start from the very, very general question. When we talk about international criminal law, what exactly are we talking about? What it is?
International criminal law is a system of law that is set up to ensure that there is some kind of accountability for what we call international crimes. And of course, then the next question is, well, what are international crimes?
Yeah, and it was was just what is it about? Just about war crimes, genocide, or it's a broader?
Yeah, so there's quite a number of crimes under the banner of international crimes. And so the ones we talk about the most are the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. But there are also other ones, and we can go into a little bit more detail throughout the podcast about what each of these crimes are, or these categories of crimes. But we also have other crimes under the umbrella. So there is torture, slavery, and maritime piracy. And in fact, maritime piracy was the very first international crime. And the reason that it was so deemed is because it happens on international waters. So it wasn't actually happening in the territorial waters of a particular country, and so therefore it was deemed an international crime. So that was the very first international crime, long before we really started thinking about the system that
medieval
we have now.
times, right? I guess.
Yeah, maritime piracy has a very, very long history, actually. And then our more recent one in the category is now called the crime of aggression, which after World War II was prosecuted as crimes against peace. So the crime of aggression is about waging war against another country, essentially.
Yes, because law is outlawed now, but it was not in medieval times or in ancient times. It was just one of the human activities of the time, normal human activities, but starting from the 20th century, it was outlawed, right?
I think we've seen a lot of evolution over history around the laws, because what has existed are laws of war. So international humanitarian law, which we can talk about in a bit more detail in a minute, but that actually has quite a long history of existing some kind of rules that apply to armed conflict. So that has hundreds, even thousands of years in different cultures around the world. Some kind of rules in some way have existed about how to fight a war. So perhaps not so much about the rules about whether or not you go to war, but at least rules around how we fight wars.
Yeah, what can you do in the process of killing other people, right?
Essentially, yes. Yeah, what is permissible and what is not. Yeah. So I just want to talk about international crimes about what makes them different. So those are the categories of crimes, but why do we call them international crimes, and what makes them different from ordinary domestic crimes? So first of all, we talk about these as crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. So they're so horrific, they're so awful, that they are elevated to a much higher level than the everyday average crime. For example, breaking and entering, robbery.
Robbery, yeah.
Secondly, they're crimes that are committed on a mass scale. So we're not just talking about one person committing a crime, one person committing one crime, one person being a victim of a crime. We are talking about hundreds, possibly thousands of people committing the crimes, and hundreds, possibly thousands, even hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people as victims of the crime.
The scale of people involved in this crime.
Yes. And that's part of why these crimes shock the conscience of humanity, not just because of what happens, but also the scale of what happens. So the third reason that these are different is because these are the types of crimes that actually are a risk to peace and security in the world, because they're happening on such a mass scale. They sometimes cross borders. They also result in the flow of people as refugees across many different borders. They can be in the context of armed conflict, which can affect neighboring countries. So these are crimes committed in the context of disturbing peace and security globally. And the final reason why these are different is because these crimes have what we call chapeau elements. So chapeau is the French word for hat. And in each of the categories, and we can go into these in a bit in detail, but in each of the three main crime categories, not only do you have to prove the crime, the individual crime that was committed, but you have to prove additional elements. So for any war crime, you have to prove these additional elements for any genocide. And that doesn't exist for ordinary domestic crimes. So these are the reasons why international crimes are so different from domestic crimes, and why they are deemed to be something that needs to be regulated under international law.
But interesting, in the case of genocides usually happen in within the borders of one state, but they are of concern of international community. And yes, that's why I always thought about this. Why international community is so interested in these genocide crimes? Because they are going on within the borders of one state, but
not always. I mean, if you think about the Armenian genocide, people crossed into Syria, what is today's Syria, on the death marches. If you look at the Holocaust, that spread across all of Eastern Europe, which was encompassed under the Third Reich, but it was still individual countries. So it's not. It's not always the Cambodian genocide, for example. Yes, that was within the borders of Cambodia, but with regards to other genocides, they certainly have cross borders. But and of course, the refugees cross borders. I mean, Armenian genocide, you had refugees fleeing into Lebanon, you had
in
refugees...
Bangladesh, we had millions of people who crossed the border with India, and
Yes, and the Rohingya have crossed into Bangladesh in the current situation. And then you have people trying to move on. Perhaps they've fled into one country, but they're trying to move into other countries. So you have Rohingya refugees mainly in Bangladesh, but many trying to flee to other countries like Indonesia or even Australia, or perhaps India.
Yes, and another thing, just to make clear for our audience, to define in international criminal law, it's about individuals, right? It's not about state, because we have this idea that it's such a shift in how we think about justice, right? If you focus in international level, but it's about individuals.
Absolutely. So we have, in international law, we talk about state accountability and we talk about individual accountability. So state accountability is when we hold a country, a state, accountable. And, for example, we have the International Court of Justice that exists. That's a court that adjudicates disputes between states and states only. So only states can be a party to those cases. Whereas what we're talking about here today, in talking about international criminal law, it is about individual criminal accountability. So just like someone could be held accountable in a domestic court for committing domestic crimes. We're talking about holding people accountable in a court. It could be a domestic court, but today we're going to be talking about international courts. So holding that person accountable in a court for the crimes that they have committed, international crimes.
Yeah, and how did all this begin? Was there is a specific moment or event that kind of kick-started the idea of prosecuting crimes at an individual level? I mean,
so I think it has really started. I mean, I mentioned that throughout history there's been a long history of having at least some kind of rules around how war is fought. And what we saw in the 1800s, basically, was really the start of an evolution of codifying the laws of war. And I think this was essentially the start, when it started from the law itself as it developed. And there are quite a lot of different sources of international criminal law. So we start with international humanitarian law, the laws of war, which is a wide variety of treaties. Most people have probably heard of the Geneva Conventions. They are, I would think, perhaps the most famous international law treaties. But there are actually many, too many to mention, treaties that we have now that have developed over time that regulate how we fight armed conflict. So treaties, for example, banning different types of weapons like landmines or blinding laser weapons or expanding and exploding bullets. So there are lots of different treaties around this. And so that was how it really started. But then, of course, we had World War II and the Holocaust. And this was really a triggering moment. And in fact, the Geneva Conventions came about after World War II. They're 1949. And after World War II, we also had the drafting of the Genocide Convention of 1948 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So it really was a triggering moment in the creation of new laws related to the commission of what we know now as international crimes. But what we also saw then was the creation of the first international criminal law tribunals and courts.
In Nuremberg, right?
Yes.
And yes, it's my next question. The Nuremberg trials always get mentioned in this context. Why were they such a big deal in the story? And so, what's the importance of this Nuremberg trial?
Well, the importance is that, they were really what we can say is the first international criminal tribunal. And I am sorry, just to clarify to our audience, the Nuremberg trials were trials then Nazi leaders and some their accomplices were stood trials for mass killings, for all these awful crimes they committed in the time of Second World War. Yes, so we had the first one, the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, or the IMT. So this is the main one that most people think of, and this is where they tried the main Nazi leaders. People like Goering were on trial at that. They essentially, the idea behind this, was obviously related to the Holocaust, but interestingly, no one was actually tried for genocide because that word was still being invented at the time by Raphael Lemkin. So people were prosecuted for crimes against peace, that is the waging of war, the waging of aggressive war. They were obviously prosecuted for war crimes, and they were also prosecuted for crimes against humanity. These were crimes that included crimes that were committed even before the war, not just during the war as well. So there was the International Military Tribunal. This was a tribunal that was set up by the USA, France, the UK, and the Soviet Union. So it was a collaborative endeavor by, what's interesting, by countries that at one point had fought against each other. But after the International Military Tribunal, there were also other what we call Nuremberg trials that were held, that were run separately by these countries, by these major countries that had been involved, but also they were held by other countries. So Poland had its own trials, for example. For example, Amon Gert, who was a commandant of a concentration camp, was tried in Poland. So they had actually national trials.
Local trials.
Yeah. And at the same time, the Tokyo Tribunal was also one. So that was officially called the International Tribunal for the Far East, but we nickname it the Tokyo Tribunal. And so that was at the same time. And the idea behind that was to try Far Eastern war criminals. So they were tried for crimes against peace, war crimes again, of course, and again, crimes against humanity. So that was similar to the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal. Not that many people tried, but it was about the leaders, the people at the top. But again, what also happened in the Asia-Pacific area is that there were national trials as well. So Australia was one of the main countries that actually held national trials for the accountability of people who had committed war crimes during the theatre of war in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, and I think it's often overshadowed how Tokyo tribunals. And interestingly, we all know about Nuremberg trials, but Tokyo, I barely hear about it. And why do you think it got sidelined in public memory?
I think because, and this is generally, like, as an Australian, speaking as someone who comes from a country that's in that region, in the Asia-Pacific region, and that was involved in World War II. In general, the war in that theatre isn't talked about as much, even though an incredible amount happened. I mean, I bet you don't know that Australia was bombed by the Japanese in World War II.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah. All across the north of Australia, there was, in particular, the bombing of Darwin is an extremely infamous event that happened in World War II. We also had a lot of Australians who were fighting in Asia, Southeast Asia, who were working on the Burma Railway, which is, well, for us in our history is very well known because it was so significant. Prisoners of war who were made to work until they died in horrific conditions. And then there were also a lot of other war crimes issues that took place with regards to rape and obviously the comfort women. So
in Korea,
Japanese,
right?
Yeah, Japanese, Korean, and so there was actually a lot that happened in the theatre of war. Papua New Guinea, for example. There were a lot of locations that people outside of that region probably don't realise what happened and what went on. And I think it's due to people in Europe have a very Eurocentric focus. People in North America have a very North America-centric focus. And of course, one thing people will know about is obviously the use of nuclear weapons by the United States, dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah. But other than that, I think there is less of an awareness because people in Europe are more focused on what happened in Europe. And North America, obviously, events like the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And
I think major chronicles of the Second World War, they came from the Western academia. That's why they were so focused on Western happenings.
I think also, though, the Holocaust is so significant. I mean, it was the murder of 6 million Jews. Yeah. It is a very significant and horrific event. So it's understandable that has such a strong focus about what happened in World War II. And also, the bombing that took place across Europe in World War II wasn't matched in other locations. The complete levelling of cities, the bombing of London, the bombing of Cologne in Germany. So, really, I think there are various reasons why that focus is on Europe. I mean, not even, there was also fighting in North Africa, and that sort of falls by the wayside as well. So there's various reasons, I think, why we don't hear as much about what happened in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, and after the Nuremberg trials and all this system of emergence of some conventions regarding to these human rights, and there is this big gap between the Nuremberg and 1990s. Am I right?
Yes.
And because what happened in that period? What's this international law on pause? in this period, or?
It's a great question. So I would say generally international law wasn't on pause because international law really developed over that time. So the creation of a lot of treaties during that time, some and a lot related to human rights as well, which are peripherally related to what we're talking about. So, for example, you have the 1984 Convention Against Torture, and then you have, what we call the Bill of Rights, the creation at the same time of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So the international law was really progressing quite a lot. And there are a lot of really amazing, interesting histories. When I teach public international law, talking about the evolution and the creation of the United Nations and the development of that organization and how it started creating law, and the different stories about that is really fascinating. But so international law in general wasn't on pause, but it's like international criminal law was on pause. And it's not that there weren't armed conflicts going on.
Yeah.
There were.
Yeah.
There was the Korean War. There was the Vietnam War, or the Indo-Chinese War.
Yeah.
There was the genocide in Cambodia in
a lot
1970s.
of conflicts in Africa, what we now call proxy wars.
Yes.
Between these two. And so it's like we had this major breakthrough, and then just, I don't know, decades of silence. Do you think it's because of the Cold War just froze everything, or not?
That may have been something to do with it. In a way, I don't really have an answer as to why there was this pause, this lack of... I wonder if it was that the system was still developing. They were creating all these treaties that were related in the field. But we had the Genocide Convention, 1948. It was already there. So there was already this mechanism by which at least states could be held accountable, but also under which state parties are obligated to prevent and punish genocide. So that means that they are obligated to pass laws in their own country prohibiting genocide, making genocide illegal as a criminal offence in a country. And do you know, of all the state parties to the Genocide Convention, they haven't still done that today.
Yeah?
So all of these years passed. So even though we had that mechanism, and the Genocide Convention was also not used at all for state accountability until it came to the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s was the first time that it actually was implemented through cases at the International Court of Justice.
Yeah.
So I think generally there was just this period of developing the laws but not really enforcing them.
And because, I think political matters, they weigh more than legal. And sometimes, I cannot recall who told it, but he told, yes, they are bad guys, but they are our bad guys. The two camps, they tried to kind of protect their own allies. And if perpetrators were on their side, they could avoid responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody likes prosecuting their own people.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the reasons why the international criminal law system was created. Because people are not prosecuting their own personnel. Like governments, they're not going to put themselves on trial for their own conduct. So that's the whole reason why this system was created, because there was so much impunity. These crimes were being committed around the world, and people were getting away with it.
Yeah, and you mentioned Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Also, I want just connect this to genocides, to crimes against humanity, and in 1990s. Why did these conflicts suddenly lead to renewed international legal action? What shifted?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So after we had the tribunals after World War II, as you say, there was decades of a gap.
Silence, yeah.
And then in the 1990s, we had the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia, which obviously disintegrated into extremely brutal conflict and genocide in Srebrenica. So in 1993, the UN Security Council decided to create the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or ICTY, as we like our acronyms in international law. And so this was designed to prosecute crimes committed in the former Yugoslavia since 1991. And they gave it jurisdiction over grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, so war crimes, and other war crimes as well, so violations of the laws of war, and crimes against humanity, and also, for the first time, genocide. And I think this came about because this was happening in Europe.
No, again.
Yeah. So this motivating factor, that why people act, and I would encourage readers to have a look at A.L. Mayros's book that he has written about the United States' reaction to different genocides, and he looks at all different factors. So I'm not a political scientist, but he is. So he gives a really good overview about particularly what people in Western countries relate to. And so here they see people that look like them, and so they're more willing to pressure their government and see, and the media reports on it. And so I think this was a motivating factor in the UN Security Council acting on this.
I'm very sorry, of course, it's maybe out of this political correctness, but maybe it's also have some moments of racism, saying how could it happen in Europe?
Yes.
Yes, you are, I'm again very sorry for my wording, but you are a savage nation somewhere in Africa, you can kill each other, but it couldn't have happened in the center of Europe.
But you're absolutely right. We can't deny the role of just straight up racism when we're talking about the reaction of states to different conflicts. So at the same time, so this was 93, and then in 94 we had the Rwandan genocide. And Romeo Dallaire, who was the head of the UN peacekeeping operation in Rwanda, in his book that he has written called Shake Hands with the Devil, which is a fantastic book, he talks about how someone from the United States government told him essentially that they weren't willing to risk American lives for African lives. So it is undeniable that that plays a part in it. And obviously the reaction was very slow when it came to Rwanda as well. And Dallaire talks about going to the Security Council. So the peacekeeping operation was mandated by the UN Security Council, but he talks about going to them with facts about what was happening on the ground and being denied a mandate. So an example, he knew that the peacekeeping mission knew that the Hutus were collecting machetes. They were stockpiling machetes. And he went to the Security Council and said, give me the mandate to go and take away the machetes, and they refused. And the machetes were the weapon that was predominantly used in the genocide. So, these challenges happened. And again, I will refer to A.L. Mayros's book, because he talks about this as Rwanda in particular and the US reaction to it, and the difficulty that they had in using the word genocide. And not wanting to take action because it was in Africa. So at least then, and I think because the ICTY had been formed in 1993, and then what happened over that 100 days in Rwanda, starting in April 1994, the pressure was so great that the Security Council, again, later in 1994, created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So it had jurisdiction over, again, war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity that took place in 1994 in Rwanda.
And how do you assess the activities, the effectiveness of these tribunals? I mean, International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. So
they both were quite successful in terms of their prosecutions. Generally, they focused on leaders, political and military leaders. Most of the time, there were some lower ranked people that were prosecuted, but the idea of them, the tribunals, was to focus on leaders, and that's generally been how international criminal law has worked. So for example, Rwanda had the Gacaca courts. They are local courts that were constituted to deal with other perpetrators, lower ranked perpetrators. And in the case of the ICTY, where they have cases brought before them that are less serious or lower ranked perpetrators, they generally refer them to the courts, for example, in Bosnia. So the tribunal has that mechanism to send some of their cases. And so there have been trials in domestic courts for lower ranked. So these two tribunals focused on leaders. So, for example, in the ICTR, one of the most well-known cases, Akayesu, he was a bourgmestre or a mayor of a region, so a local political leader who had a very prominent role in the genocide. And of course, the ICTY, even higher up, prosecuting people like Milosevic, so the former head of state, but also military leaders like General Ratko Mladic. Yeah. So the ICTY, both tribunals had their challenges in terms of actually getting the suspects into the court, because of course some of them fled. And we know the challenges they had in getting Mladic, who was in Serbia in hiding. And it took a long time, but they eventually did. And I think there are only maybe one or two people that the ICTR is still looking for. So they were fairly successful. The majority of people that came through were convicted. The ICTR, most of the cases were genocide cases. And so they convicted a large number of people for genocide.
I think they are very effective also from the perspective of developing of international law, right? Because, for example, in the if I'm not mistaken, in the case of Akayesu, they kind of clarified the moment in genocide convention, saying how it's called, imposing mental and physical harm on people, and rape was considered as one of the genocidal actions, and just they help to develop some vague moments in genocide convention. Am I right?
You are correct. Because they had so many trials, they were very significant bodies in terms of developing international law. So developing the process, obviously, like how does this court work? How does this tribunal function? And ensuring that fair trial rights were part of that, but also developing the law of the crimes themselves. So when you look at something like the Genocide Convention, or you look at the treaties on the laws of war, there's no detailed definition of the crimes. And so when when the prosecutor goes to court, they have to make arguments as to why particular conduct fits within that crime, and then the court has to make a decision about whether or not, yes, okay, this was genocide or it was war crimes. So a lot of that discussion took place. So they developed all like an extraordinary amount of aspects of the laws of war, of genocide, of crimes against humanity, just working out how to define all of those different crimes. And you're absolutely right. It's a great example of Akayesu, because it was the first case to say that, yes, rape is a crime of genocide because it amounts to serious bodily or mental harm. So that kind of development has been extremely significant in terms of how do we define genocide? And genocide has so many components within it that have been challenging to define. And the ICTR, as I said, almost every conviction was for genocide, so it contributed quite a lot. In the ICTY, there were fewer convictions for genocide because they were only related to Srebrenica. But nonetheless, again, they still contributed. So these are really, there are certainly criticisms of the courts and tribunals, and I'm in no way saying that everything is perfect. But their contribution was really significant in very many ways. And, the two main ones essentially are the successful prosecution of perpetrators of horrific crimes, and two, this incredible development of international law. Actually, probably I should say three, because the third thing is that courts can contribute to the collection of history, so the collection of the stories of history, because international criminal law has such a connection with history, and it's because essentially we're looking at something that happened in the past, but we also have to look at the reasons behind it. You know, this armed conflict, what happened, who were the parties to the conflict. So although the goal of courts is to collect evidence to either convict or acquit someone individually of a crime, at the same time, there's still a lot of history and storytelling in that. You have a lot of witnesses who are there talking about what they experienced and what happened. So I think that's a third important role of these courts, is to capture history.
Yeah, and also I can add the fourth one, saying that it brought the attention of the world again to the term of genocide. It showed that genocide is not just something historical. It's something that can happen now with us, and I think this is another important contribution of these courts to the history. And also another important thing I want just to add, this collection of materials that we can use in historical research. The same thing we have after the Armenian genocide, then prosecution of Turkish military courts of the Turkish leaders after the Armenian genocide, and the first corpus of materials that became the basis for initial research of Armenian genocide came from the from the eyewitnesses interrogation, or I mean interviews or interrogation of criminals who stood trial in Istanbul. So all these results of documents gathered by investigation committees, they became the basics of research of Armenian genocide. That's why, yes, these trials are important also from historical point of view, as
absolutely. And you know, a lot of these the courts and tribunals that we're talking about have archives. I mean, the ICTY has warehouses full of documents because we're talking about mass atrocities, and so there's so much documentation and mass atrocities that were committed over years. So there's so much documentation that they have warehouses full of it.
And these two tribunals, they were temporary, just tribunals created just only for this time period, and now they finished their work?
Yes, so they're called ad hoc tribunals, and they're called ad hoc because they have very specific jurisdiction. So they have what we call limited temporal and limited geographic jurisdiction, and what that means is they only have jurisdiction over crimes committed in a certain place and at a particular time. So both of those tribunals have now closed, and what we have left is the United Nations mechanism for international criminal tribunals, and that mechanism is essentially just winding up anything, like any appeals that are left, and just the remaining kind of administration and any cases that are left, but they have officially closed at this point. So they were started in 1993 and 1994, and you know, but have now finished their time.
And what we have in now, another tribunal, another place to go in this cases.
We do, but before we mention that, I should also mention there have been a couple of other ad hoc tribunals that are also important.
Yes, go ahead.
So there was the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was created in the year 2000, and the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia in 2003. And these are what we call hybrid tribunals.
What does it mean? Because
they are not just international; they're created within the legal system of the national legal system. Okay. So, the title of the Cambodian Tribunal, or Khmer Rouge Tribunal, as it can be called, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. So that one actually says it in the name. So it's a chamber that exists within Cambodia's legal system, and it has half Cambodian and half international staff. So it is also closing, or isn't it? No more cases going forward, and is in the process of establishing a legacy institute, which again will be like archives, and researchers will have access to that. So the Special Court for Sierra Leone was related to the civil war that took place in Sierra Leone in the late 1990s. And again, it had jurisdiction over war crimes and other serious violations of international humanitarian law, and also crimes under Sierra Leonean law. So any general domestic crimes. But it didn't have jurisdiction over crimes against humanity or genocide because they were deemed not relevant for that conflict. For Cambodia, this was about crimes committed under the Khmer Rouge in what was then called Democratic Kampuchea. That was the name of Cambodia. From the 17th of April 1975, which was the day that the Khmer Rouge rolled into Phnom Penh, to the 6th of January 1979, when they lost power. And this was a slightly different wording because it was created within the Cambodian court, so it was a little bit different. So it had 3 crimes that were listed from the 1956 Cambodian Penal Code, so the criminal law that already existed in the 1970s. So torture, murder, and religious persecution. So these were separately listed crimes. Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Specifically, though, a separate listing for destruction of cultural property during armed conflict.
Oh, interesting.
Which is a war crime, but it was listed separately. Yeah. And then it also had, interestingly, crimes against internationally protected people under the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. So the ECCC is an interesting one because it is actually quite different to the other courts. But again, this is a court that's wrapping up. It's also a court that has contributed significantly to the development of the law. In particular, I would say the development, the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the Cambodia Tribunal, the development of the law related to forced marriage, the crime of forced marriage, which interestingly, just as a side note, is not a crime that is listed in any of these courts that I have mentioned. And so they decided they had to think of a way to prosecute it because it was so ubiquitous in the conflicts that we're talking about. So they prosecuted it, and there was... I won't go into detail because it's a long story, and I've written articles about it if anyone's interested. But, essentially there was sort of a debate as the prosecutions went through about how it should be prosecuted. And the short version is that it is now prosecuted as under the generic crime called other inhumane acts.
Yeah.
So really, these ad hoc tribunals have contributed quite a lot in many different ways.
Yeah, I want to bring our conversation to ICC, International Criminal Court, because it launched with a lot of fanfare. What was with the hope behind it, and how has it matched up with the reality?
Yeah, shall we start at the beginning then?
Yes,
we
have to.
How it was created?
It's interesting.
So obviously, we've been talking about all these ad hoc tribunals, which, there's a lot of work. If every time you have a conflict, you have to create a new international or a hybrid tribunal, it's a huge amount of work. It's a huge amount of resources. So the idea actually had been floated for quite a long time of having a permanent international criminal court. And it took a long time, but in 1998, a statute for this court was finally created at a conference in Rome. And then on the 1st of July 2002, the court finally came into being. And so this is a permanent international criminal court that now exists. And I would like to say that it will take the place of any ad hoc tribunal, but that isn't necessarily the case because it does have restrictions on its jurisdiction. But this is a court that has jurisdiction over the 4 main crimes of international criminal law, so war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. So it only has jurisdiction, and I said there were some limitations. So the court only has jurisdiction over crimes that were committed in the territory of a state party. So I'm from Australia. Australia is a state party, and Armenia is now a state party as well, which is fantastic. So if I committed a crime in Australia and Australia didn't want to prosecute, I could possibly be tried by the International Criminal Court. They also have jurisdiction over crimes committed by a national of a state party. So you and I are nationals of state parties. So if either of us committed an international crime anywhere in the world, we could be subject to being prosecuted by the ICC. Now, this is only, however, if a state is unwilling or unable to investigate or prosecute themselves. So as an Australian, if I committed war crimes, the idea is that Australia should have now a robust legal system that enables them to prosecute me for that. And I will say that actually, in fact, that's what Australia is doing. So we had a report come out a few years ago about allegations of war crimes committed by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. And Australia set up Office of the Special Investigator, which has been investigating these war crimes. And so far, one person has been charged with the war crime of murder. So in that way, you can say that Australia is willing and able to prosecute it. So we have the laws, we have war crimes in our national legislation. And so in this case, we can say the ICC doesn't need to step in because Australia is doing what it should be, which is actually really great. So the idea is that in this sense, the ICC is what we call a court of last resort. It's designed to create a system of international criminal law where countries sign up to the court, and then what they do as part of that obligation is to put those crimes into their own domestic law, and that they should be the ones to prosecute. But the reason we need a court is because sometimes states are just not willing to do that. We talked about the fact that governments don't want to prosecute themselves. So they just don't want to do that. But we also need to consider this idea of states being unable to, in the sense that we know that in post-conflict situations, countries have collapsed, their infrastructure has collapsed. That might include the legal system. And so it becomes logistically impossible for countries to go through the legal process. And so the ICC can help with that and be part of that accountability process.
Yeah, and of course, the ICC, International Criminal Court, has had critics. Some say it's biased, and others say it's toothless. And what's your take on this love-hate relationship with the ICC?
So obviously, you know, I work in the field, so I'm a big supporter of the court, and I think it's really significant. I'm hesitant to call it a full argument about bias. Is people saying, "Oh, it only prosecutes Africans."
Yeah, why? But there is a lot of focus on Africa. Why have so many ICC cases came from there?
So I'll tell you why. Because those countries referred themselves to the court. They asked the court to investigate, to step in. That's why. Okay. So these arguments about bias are absurd, because when it started, the first countries that came to the court and said, please investigate and prosecute, there was the countries themselves. Okay. So that argument just continues to frustrate me. And if you now look at the record, there are so many investigations that have nothing to do with Africa that are in other places in the world. You have Ukraine, you have Philippines.
This is changing, right?
Yeah. Oh, it has been for a long time. So there are so many other places that it is looking at all around the world, in almost every continent. So Africa, Europe, Asia, and South America are continents around the world where the ICC has investigations, has or had. So that argument just doesn't fly anymore. I will say, though, that I do have frustrations with how some more prominent cases seem to progress faster than others. Yeah. So as an example, you know, thinking about it is investigating crimes in Ukraine and in Palestine, and as it should, and how quickly arrest warrants were issued in that case, but how long it has been investigating crimes committed against the Rohingya people in Myanmar while we wait for any arrest warrants in that case. Many years. So that's where my frustration lies. The focus on these high-level cases.
Yeah, I also see how slow or kind of selective it can be, and so and sometimes I even, of course, I understand how it's historic that it exists, but at the same time, sometimes I think that if I wonder if it's doing more harm than good to the idea of justice.
I'm never going to agree with that.
No?
Because the thing is, we know what impunity looks like because it existed before this. You know, that gap we were talking about, decades of impunity of people just committing horrific crimes. And there is proof that the ICC has a deterrent factor. People have done studies. And so in particular, one of the first prosecutions and one of the first convictions, I should say, that the court had was for child soldier crimes. So the recruitment and use of child soldiers of someone who was the leader of a non-state armed group. And people have done studies and found that that case had an impact on the behavior of non-state armed groups in Africa, who specifically thought, we won't do that because if we do that, we're going to be brought before the International Criminal Court. So it does have a deterrent effect. And the one thing I will say is, of course it doesn't deter everyone, but neither does ordinary criminal law. And we don't talk about that ordinary criminal law should be thrown out.
We have more expectations of something that is called international. This wording is...
and I get asked this a lot, people saying, international criminal or international law doesn't really seem to work. And I say, well, criminal law doesn't. People still commit crimes, and we don't question the existence of that law. So what's really important to remember is that every single day, states and individuals comply with international law. So, for example, and I know this is a little extreme, but today you and I are not committing war crimes. So we're complying with international law. But even in the context of armed conflict, people are complying. So if you look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, for example, while I'm not going to say that Ukraine's record is 100% perfect, in general we can say that they're complying with the laws of war in the fighting of that war. So that is important to remember, and that we know what impunity looks like because we've seen it for decades, that leaders who want to run regimes, genocidal regimes or authoritarian regimes, think they can get away with everything. And, this court shows that it's not necessarily the case. I mean, look recently, Duterte, the former president of the Philippines, an arrest warrant was issued for him by the court for his so-called war on drugs related to crimes against humanity, related to the murder of thousands of people who were allegedly drug dealers. Now, he was in power and everyone thought there will never be any accountability. And he even withdrew Philippines from the International Criminal Court. However, there was a change of regime, there was a change of government. The government changed. They said, no, we're not going to hand him over to the court. But then there was a falling out between the current government and Duterte's family. And guess what? They arrested him, surrendered him to the International Criminal Court, and now he is at the court awaiting his trial for crimes against humanity. So, and, I recently was talking about this with someone from the Philippines who said it has given people in the Philippines so much hope that there is accountability. So this kind of thing is so important.
To all people, and also to kind of reminder to dictators, saying one day you will not be in power, and maybe they will come and knocking at your door saying we are from International Criminal Court. And
absolutely. And in this case, so he had traveled to, I think it was Hong Kong, and he flew back into Manila and was arrested at the airport when he entered Manila. It's
maybe another.
But you're so right, and I think this is why it's so important, because we don't know. If there's a regime change in Russia, for example, we don't know. Maybe Putin will end up in the dock.
Okay, I hope such case in Azerbaijan, of course, firstly.
Yes, that would.
And maybe another problem for the International Criminal Court that some major powers never joined the ICC. United States, Russia, China. What's holding them back from... I don't know. Is it just politics or something deeper? What do you think?
Well, it's because they don't want any of their own people to be held accountable for anything that their countries have done. I mean, of course, look at Russia, what they're doing, committing a lot of war crimes. China has, a terrible history when it comes to human rights. And, I've written about some of China's historical and present human rights abuses, and actually from the lens of international criminal law to assess whether or not you could consider this conduct to be international crimes. And in some cases you can. Mm-hmm. And of course, at the moment, the Uyghur genocide in China is taking place in Xinjiang province. So these are countries that don't want to be held accountable for what they're doing. And the United States has been very vocal about why they're not. So the United States signed the treaty but never ratified it, and they since unsigned it. Trump is very anti-ICC and has implemented sanctions against anyone who works at or has a connection with the ICC. And of course, this is really appalling behaviour, because this is an independent court, and it has very strict parameters about its jurisdiction. It doesn't make political decisions about who it tries, and it doesn't go outside the parameters of its jurisdiction. So, someone who is a United States citizen could only possibly be tried by the ICC if they committed an international crime in the territory of a state party. So it's very strict, and the criticism from the United States is unwarranted, and the sanctions, what it does, it's a disruption to the rule of law and to the respect for the rule of law, an independent judicial mechanism that ensures accountability for horrific crimes. And for the United States, now it is not just about US citizens, but their friends, their political friends that they want to protect as well. So now there is an arrest warrant out for the Israeli head of state, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the former Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant. So the United States considers Israel its friend, and so that's, again, one of the reasons why Trump's regime has escalated its behavior and brought these sanctions. And obviously the sanctions have quite a significant impact, particularly when you have people who have assets, maybe they have a US bank account. And a lot of people are worried, including scholars, because there are scholars who are affiliated with the court. Yeah. For example, working as special advisors to the prosecutor. Yeah. So, it's really very poor behaviour on the part of the United States, and I think I'm putting that mildly.
Okay. And now coming to another two big problems or issues with this international criminal law is victor's justice. There is this idea of that it's victor's justice. How fair is that? Critique historically and today, what do you think? This
concept, this argument came about really, even after World War II, talking about the trials that were held then, because it was victor's justice. But in one sense, who else is going to try the criminals?
Yes, but they say that the winners of war rarely face tribunals.
Yes,
and also it's kind of justice for the oppressed of just, political dressed up in legal robes, right? Or just...
I don't know that I fully agree with that. I agree to some point. So yes, that if there are crimes committed by victors, they tend to go unpunished. And that is a problem.
Unfortunately,
yeah. As I've said, no government is going to prosecute themselves and their own personnel. And it's a huge source of frustration generally. When we look at, for example, the United States and the Vietnam War and the massacre at My Lai, for which William Calley was prosecuted and convicted and then not long after pardoned. You know, this kind of conduct, it doesn't have a deterrent effect. It's not going to prevent future crimes from being committed if no one is held accountable. So I absolutely believe that it doesn't matter which side you're on. If crimes are being committed, they should be genuinely investigated and prosecuted. And it's actually one of the reasons why I'm really proud of my own country, Australia, at the moment, which is nice to say, that they have created this Office of the Special Investigator and that they are actively investigating war crimes allegations, because we don't see that very often, and certainly not from Western countries. So I do agree that there are issues from that perspective, but I also am glad to see that perpetrators do get held accountable, because that does need to happen.
Yeah, and you know, here in Armenia we have this hunch, we have this feeling, I don't know if it's relevant or not, but that there are such double standards, how the world responds to some conflicts and not others. Does international law have an answer to that?
I wish I had one, because the challenge of international law is that it is subject to international relations, politics, and it is a source of frustration to me as well. I mean, as you know, but your listeners may not, I've also been working on international criminal law issues related to Artsakh for many years, and it is a great source of frustration that just like a week before the ethnic cleansing, I was participating with the former prosecutor of the ICC and Swedish journalist Rasmus Kahnbach in a panel speaking to the United Kingdom government to advocate for them to do something about the blockade. And then a week later, the ethnic cleansing happened. So it is just a huge source of frustration that issues like politics, but also resources, because of course the challenge with the United Kingdom and getting them to act is, of course, BP, British Petroleum, the company, has gas interests in Azerbaijan. So these kinds of things are just, it is a source of frustration, and it does make, for me, it's a challenge working in the field, and I know other people at the moment in the field are feeling it, that we, especially for the past at least 12 months, but we are seeing a lot of disrespect for international law and a lot of violations of international law. But you are right, also the unequal application of the law. So the ethnic cleansing happened, and it did get attention for about a week until the 7th of October. And then it disappeared off the radar of anybody. Well, I say anybody, but I will say that Swedish journalist Rasmus Kahnbach continues to report on it in depth. So there are some people that are still out there remembering what happened and demanding, and from my side, demanding accountability.
Not so optimistic predictions for the future, but anyway, and you know, it's kind of maybe strange question, but if you could redesign system today and start from the scratch, what would you do? What would you keep and what would you toss out?
I tell you what, the biggest thing is a different structure for the Security Council, the UN Security Council.
Interesting, yeah.
Because that has such a significant impact on so many things. So, for example, when states in the Security Council are trying to pass a resolution that would make a difference, that would implement, that would enforce international law, and all it takes is one veto from one of the P5, usually Russia, China, or the United States. So they're the ones that use their veto. Actually, France and Britain don't really use their veto power and haven't done for years. So one of those three states. So the veto power is a huge problem. It's also it politicizes the Security Council. So it is so frustrating. People ask about the International Court of Justice and how its decisions can be enforced if a state refuses to comply. And the answer to that is, in the International Court of Justice statute, the UN Security Council. But of course, depending on what that is, again, that will never happen because of the veto power. So this is a huge source of frustration. And it is it is discussed a lot amongst scholars and practitioners. But the challenge is, of course, because the only way to reform the Security Council is by a positive vote from all members, including the P5 of the Security Council. Yeah. So one of my colleagues in Australia at Deakin University, Tamsin Page, has written quite a lot on this and essentially has come to the conclusion that the Security Council will never be reformed because it's really impossible and we need to look at other avenues. Yeah. So I think for me, that's the one thing that if I could go back in time, I would change how the Security Council was set up and how its powers were structured. I think that would make such a significant difference in the creation and enforcement of international law.
Yeah. And another maybe full question, but what role do you think civil society or regular people play in shaping international law? Or maybe it is still an elite game of...
Oh, no, not at all. No, civil society individuals, very significant role to play. So, okay, let's start with just individuals. I always say, and I often get asked, what can we do? Like if I give a talk on a particular situation, it might be the Rohingya, it might be Artsakh. People ask, what can I do as an individual? I always say, advocate to your politician, your local member of parliament. Tell them what you know and what you think that your government should do, because they need to hear from you. And the thing is, actually, in my experience, politicians don't necessarily have the knowledge about things that are happening in remote places around the world. Coming from Australia, we are remote. We are an island. We're very far. So having spent time in Canberra talking to politicians about Artsakh, they don't know. They don't know what's going on. So the individual person, if you learn about this and if you know about it, write to your politicians and say, hey, look, this is going on. And as my member, here's what I want you to do. Here's what the government should be doing. And I think that that's really useful. I mean, obviously, it's only useful if you live in a democratic society. But for individuals, that's what I always advocate doing. And also, honestly, just talk with your friends about it. Like say, hey, there's this going on. Just create general awareness for people about it. Civil society more broadly, huge role to play. So, for example, when they were in Rome drafting the statute for the International Criminal Court, civil society had a very significant role in what went into that statute. The Women's Caucus was absolutely fundamental in ensuring that crimes of sexual violence, so sexual and gender-based crimes, were included in the Rome Statute. It's one of the most significant things that civil society has done. In the court as it exists now, civil society can participate, and even individuals, through being what we call amicus curiae, or friends of the court. And that happens, the court will make a call in a particular case because they want input on particular aspects of the law that relate to that case. So as an example, I've been involved in this as an amicus curiae group where we made a written submission to the court related to the law around the crime of forced marriage, and then we made oral submissions to the court, and all of that was actually implemented by the court in its appeal ruling. So that is another example of how, and we weren't the only ones. There were other groups who made submissions on different aspects of the law, and that were also taken on, not all of them, but some of them taken on by the court. So that's a really significant way that civil society can contribute to the development of international law. At what I would say at the moment is one of the strongest ways that civil society not only can but is contributing is next year we will see the preparatory commissions on a Crimes Against Humanity treaty. So a draft treaty,
finally.
Yes, a draft treaty has come through the Sixth Committee, and next year they're starting the preparatory commissions, and it will then move on to negotiations. So there's a period from 2026 to 2029 in which we will see preparatory commissions and then negotiations for a Crimes Against Humanity treaty. And I can say that civil society has been heavily involved in that process so far, including academics. Professor Layla Sadat, who is a law professor, she has been working on this for many years, advocating for a Crimes Against Humanity treaty. You also have organizations like the Global Justice Center, which is advocating for what they call gendering the Crimes Against Humanity treaty, and they have made an amazing website, which is cahtreatynow.org, that provides lots of information about why we should have a treaty, and even goes into detail about specific crimes as well. And that is a fantastic resource and is actually used by governments, by policymakers in their work on this treaty. So they are looking at this work that civil society has done. And I know about this because I'm one of the contributors in trying to get forced marriage into the treaty. And I know this because I've spoken to people, to government representatives, who say they look at these briefs that are written to try and understand what are the issues, and then they take that back to their government, who then, well, may or may not agree with it and make the argument for inclusion in the treaty. So civil society actually can have a really significant impact. And essentially what civil society is doing with the Crimes Against Humanity treaty is trying to be part of those preparatory commissions and negotiations, to be able to come in, actually be in the room and be part of those negotiations, and to ensure that, first of all, that a treaty is created and that a treaty comes about, but also that there are specific provisions in it. So in the groups that I'm working with, we're advocating for gendering the treaty, so ensuring that there's representation of sexual and gender-based crimes, but also children are reflected, and the experiences of children are reflected in the treaty as well. Yeah. So a lot of work for civil society. It's not only the people at the top.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, and I just want to remind our audience that this term, Crimes Against Humanity and Civilization, was one of the first cases, and this term was mentioned, was the May Declaration of 1915, regarding to Armenian massacres in the Ottoman Empire. This May Declaration of Free States, France, Great Britain, and Russia. And I know that you touched this moment in your book, or not? I think not so. Okay, and thank you, Melanie. And I think that what gets me in that international criminal law is one of the few tools that gives victims voice. Victims a voice on the global stage. And yes, it's not perfect, it's not ideal, but without it, things would be much worse, I think. And that's why, yes, it's very significant to have such framework, such thing as international criminal law.
I agree with you. I think we are better off with it than without it. And, there's so much that we could talk about, but I will just say, yes, in terms of giving victims a voice, the courts and the way they're set up now, so particularly, for example, the International Criminal Court, victims actually play a part in the trials. So there is significant impact on victims being able to tell their story, to be involved in the process, and there's also provision for reparations for victims. So that is a really big part of it. And it's obviously why we do the work that we do. We want to ensure that there's justice for the victims of these kinds of crimes. So, there are challenges, that is definitely for sure, but I will always stand by this, having these courts and tribunals, and obviously support the rule of law.
Okay, thank you, Melanie, for this discussion, for your thoughts, for provoking things, something to think about. And before we wrap up, I want to zoom out a bit. And one of the things we often talk about on this podcast is the value of humanities and social sciences, and because especially at the time when it feels like they're in crisis in Armenia, definitely, and I'm sure not only in Armenia, unfortunately, but around the world. And so I'd love to ask, why do you think it still matter? Why should we be involved in this field? Why we need to research, to study history, law, philosophy, and all these social sciences?
Oh, this is a great question. I feel very strongly about, we call it HAS, short. Obviously as someone who is a researcher in the field of humanities and social sciences, in my school, I work in the law school at the University of Western Australia, and I'm the deputy head of School of Research. And so one of the things that I'm always advocating for is the recognition of humanities and social sciences research. And I say this, you may hear the frustration in my voice, because I find that what we shorten STEM research, so science, technology, engineering, and medicine research, always is prioritized. It's prioritized for funding. It's prioritized as in promotion of research. It's prioritized, it wins more awards. So there's a challenge in getting HAS research recognized for what it is and what it does. And it's so significant. When I see some things that colleagues research, and it's so important and so relevant, and I just can't comprehend. Well, I don't know, but speaking in Australia, we had 10 years of Conservative government who waged a war on higher education, but particularly humanities and social sciences. And the reason is because it gets people to think critically. It produces critical thinkers, and critical thinkers can be critical of the government. And the government doesn't like that. So it's political, and it's the creation, it's the dumbing down of society. And, I do see it out there. I see it in comments on social media from people who have a real hatred of academics. And, in particular, things that they fear. So things like gender studies, they have a real hatred of. And it's really disturbing because, in World War II, Churchill was funding things related to the arts. And someone said to him, why are we spending money on the arts when there's a war going on? And he said, what are we fighting for if it's not this? And by this he meant culture and the arts. Yeah. And that's what we give. Yeah. History is so important. We need to learn what happened in, I would say, our world generally. Not even just our country, what happened in our society, what happened in the world in the past. To
understand how human beings act.
Right? But absolutely. And also, it's a cliche, but you need to learn about history to try and stop it from happening again. Yeah. Yeah. It's true. It's a cliche, but it's true. Yeah. So, and I just think, I look at different social science, look at, criminology. They're looking at how do we understand crime? How do we prevent crime? It's such a practical study with genuine real life impact. But also, that doesn't mean that something like philosophy isn't important, because thinking is important. Yeah. Thinking about who we are as humans.
And it creates meanings of everything.
Absolutely.
Of life, or action, or everything, yeah.
And thinking about one of our colleagues, for example, Henry Theriault, who's a philosopher, and every time I see him present, I'm just blown away by the concepts that he produces. Yeah. And so what would our world be without that? Yeah. Right. I don't even want to imagine. Yeah. So I feel
it's okay.
I feel very strongly about supporting humanities and social sciences.
Yes, and I have my very, very last question, maybe to bring it close to you, a more personal question. what drew you to this field in the first place? What made you want to study and teach international law and write this book? I want to show to our audience this. I haven't read it yet, but I promise this audience to read this book and write a review.
You hear that, audience? You have to hold him to that he's going to read the book.
From discrimination to death, genocide process through a human right lens. So why? What motivated you? What pushed you to this field? Yeah,
so this is something that I've been thinking about over the past couple of years, and for some reason hadn't really thought about before. But I started thinking about, like when I was growing up, when I was in school, and I don't know what really clicked with making me think about this, but I think about movies that I really liked. And you're going to think this is a strange answer, but one of the movies I loved was Dances with Wolves. And
with Kevin Costner, right?
Yes. Yeah. And obviously I loved it because it had Kevin Costner in it. But, watching it again later in life, realizing that it's such a commentary on colonialism and colonial violence and, people rising up against that. But I also loved, and still love, of course, Footloose. And Footloose, and you may laugh and you're like, but this is a movie about dance with great 80s music. Yes, but it's also about standing up against arbitrary rules. So I believe in the rule of law, but I don't believe in arbitrary rules and authoritarianism. And Footloose is about standing up against that. There's even a scene where people try to burn books in that movie. Yeah. So these are movies that I really connected with when I was growing up. And then I would do assignments like, also about environmental justice. So I did an assignment on saving the baby fur seals because that was a big issue at the time. So it was something that I think was just always, this idea of social justice was always something that I had. And then when I went to university, I studied history and law. And in history, I did a lot of studies like communist China, the Holocaust, and so all of that, international criminal law. So all I ever wanted to be was a criminal lawyer. That was even from when I was a kid, that's what I wanted to be. But when you put together history and criminal law, you get international criminal law. So, and I think, studying during my history degree, and I actually studied history to the highest level in high school as well, in which I also studied the Holocaust. So studying these kinds of things really got me wondering, how does one person do that to another? Like, how can humans do that? And so that will be a question that, even though I technically know the answers to now, I still don't know the answer in reality, like the real. But I think that is just the things that motivated me, and bringing together history and criminal law. And, when I did my law degree, studying advanced criminal law, studying international law, studying forensics, these kinds of things were what really interested me. I was never interested in things like company law, commercial law, and if you look at my transcript from my law degree, it's very different, credit for commercial law and high distinction for international law. So, that's just where my passion lies. And it's, ultimately about, justice for those victims who experience this. And I think we're really lucky. We're really privileged in the work that we do, and getting to help these people who maybe their voice can't always be there. And so we can help that.
At least we try, yeah.
We can't change the world. We're only one person, each of us, but we can make a little bit of a difference in our life. Yeah,
you're right. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you for this fascinating conversation, and that gave me and my audience a lot about this foundational knowledge on the subject. Thank you very much, and good luck in your projects and your work.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It is an honor to be here.
Thank you.